Well, hi there and welcome to weeks 2 and 3 of this educational technology class. During week 1, I asked you to develop a basic course website shell. And that shell or that website had a purpose fundamentally, which was to provide a means for you to be able to communicate with me all of the things that I want you to create or develop or reflect upon throughout the class. And it's a way of organizing those classroom artifacts as well. And so I'm going to kind of impose upon you an organizational structure, and that is going to be very helpful for you to be able to keep track of things and then conceptually kind of put things together and reflect on things that relate to each other. So there's a good reason for that overall shell. And then I asked you to communicate through a very creative act by using Canva to communicate some important information about yourself, some personal information about yourself. And by posting it on your website, you made it public for the other students in the class to be able to learn more about you, and most importantly for me to be able to learn more about you. So that in itself was an act of creativity. I asked you to do something that was technically maybe something you haven't done before, which is create a website and then embed something in it from another source. And so there's some underlying kind of opportunity for you to get comfortable taking pieces and making pieces that are digital and then bringing them all together. But more than that, I really was hoping that the act itself and then the products of that act, your files, your presentations, would help establish a personal identity for you within the class, and that is sort of the first step in building community, in building a classroom community. So it's, first of all, providing a communication infrastructure, especially when you're working with a classroom environment like this where it's asynchronous and we're not all in the same room. So we have that, and then an opportunity to communicate to everybody else in this community who you are. So you did all of that in 1 week, so congratulations to that. I'm really glad that we're at this point now because we're heading into weeks 2 and 3, and to be perfectly honest with you, I think what I'm going to be asking you to accomplish by the end of week 3 is going to be something that is the most important thing I think that you are going to do in this class. And in fact, it's one of the most important things I think you're going to do in your entire education experience at Radford. And the unusual thing about it is that at its core, it has actually nothing to do with technology. It has to do with something that is more important than technology. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So before I discuss or introduce what that part of the weeks 2 and 3 project is, I want to start with a story that's going to kind of lay the foundation for the stuff that I want you to think about and develop in the next couple of weeks. So when I was just starting out as a young researcher and evaluator, following 10 years of working as a junior high school science teacher, I earned my degree in an area called instructional technology, which has less to do about computers and mostly deals with designing and developing effective learning environments. And it just so happens that computers and computer-based media were part of the landscape of some of the things that were investigated in my graduate work regarding the development of effective learning experiences. And so I'm a newly minted graduate student in the field. And one of the very first jobs I got, in addition to working as a faculty member in an education program, is I got a job evaluating a computer-based product that was kind of popular at the time. And the product was called Plato. And it was one of the very first computer-based learning systems that was developed as what's called a competency-based system, where learners would take a pretest in a particular subject, and then the computer would set up some simple learning modules and assessments that help the learners learn what they didn't perform well on in the pretest, and then it presented some instruction, just straight, direct instruction, and some examples and that kind of thing, and then it tested them again. And if they passed it, then they moved on to the next related subject or related topic in the subject area. One of the most important areas that it was used for early on was in math instruction, but it branched out into all subjects in schools. And this was a product that was created and implemented in some schools not before the internet, but before the World Wide Web. So it was essentially something that you could install in lab-based computers, and then they were all connected to each other. So their use was limited to computer labs at schools. It wasn't the kind of thing that you could just sort of set one computer in a classroom and have a student individually work on that. It was something you would install in a computer lab. Well, I was asked to evaluate its implementation in a way that was not for direct classroom use. And that was, it was installed in a computer lab that was part of a public housing area in either Cincinnati or Cleveland. It's been a while, and it was an Ohio town, but it was one of those two. And it was designed for an after-school remediation program that wasn't part of the school, but it was part of the housing project. So again, this was government subsidized housing that was offering an opportunity for students who were struggling in school to come to this lab in the housing community after school, and then they would develop or they would experience what Plato had to offer them individually. And they were, now, as you might expect, it wasn't necessarily something that the students sought out to do. They had other things going on after school, that's for sure. And by the way, the age level for this was about grades 7 through 10, roughly. So they had other things to do, but there was an arrangement made with the local schools that if some students were struggling in class and they were exhibiting some behavior problems, that rather than sort of be placed in school suspension or something, that they might be placed after school in this program in the area where they lived. And there was somebody who was assigned to manage the process as well. But essentially these students would go after school and they would log in, and the computer would know who they were, and they had to put in a certain number of hours or a certain amount of time in this after-school system. And my job was to go and collect data from the system itself and analyze it to see how well the system in place was impacting, or whether or not it was impacting their performance in school. So I had access to school performance grades and classroom assessments. But I was also there just to sort of document the experience. What were these kids doing? How were they experiencing it in this after-school program? And I have to tell you, it was a bit discouraging when I went to go visit them, and when I went to go be part of making these observations. And I'll fast forward to just a couple of years ago. It was discouraging for the same way it was when I was studying the way kids were interacting with similar types of computer-based remediation or computer-based instruction during the pandemic. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll just give you a summary of what was observed. First of all, I will say that it seemed marginally beneficial in terms of the relationship between how much the students were logged into the system after school and what impact it had on their experiences in school academically. So it was marginally effective for the population that I was studying. But it was no surprise, because when I went to go visit these students after school in this area, I saw a lot of kids whose heads were on the desk and their hands were moving and they were clicking a mouse. These were computers that just started using mice, and they were clicking through stuff and their heads were down. And they seemed, generally speaking, they seemed very, very unengaged. Now, this wasn't how they seemed when they first started using the programs. Well, at first, I think there was a lot of, they appeared to invest more mental effort and more interest in reading what was on the screen and interacting with things and getting feedback and moving on. And it seemed early on that there was a lot of promise. But as things wore on, what I was sensing, and certainly the data I was collecting when I would talk to the kids, was that they got bored with the system very quickly. And because they were bored with the system, they weren't as invested in trying to learn from it the way they were when they first started, the novelty effect. And that probably led to its limited success in having a positive impact on their performance in schools. Well, I noticed something very similar during the pandemic when a lot of students, a lot of elementary students especially, were working at home, and teachers were assigning some work using a tool like Google Classroom, and they would embed like Khan Academy, similar kinds of a math system to Plato, in that it was, you took a pretest, and the pretest indicated areas that you needed some work in, and then it would present these direct instruction. A lot of it was Saul Khan explaining math things to you, and he was really good at it. And then there would be some practice, some assessment during it. But very similar to what I experienced more than 20 years prior was kids getting bored with it very quick, seeing a lot of Zoom webcams of kids working and their heads down and click, 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 very kind of mindless. So very limited, in my opinion, very limited success. And the research bears it out. There's limited success with those kinds of programs. And I'm going to suggest that there's kind of two reasons for that. One is that the systems were not engaging the learners in experiences that provided meaning and purpose to the things that they were expected to learn. These were just bite-sized little instructional pieces that may or may not have been connected to each other, and certainly weren't connected to a context in which learning the things that they were expected to learn had some inherent meaning to them or had purpose. So that was one thing. Another thing is that I believe that a lot of what the kids were expected to learn, both 20 years ago and during the pandemic, a lot of the things that they were expected to learn were fundamentally pretty boring, and fundamentally established a very, very low engagement experience, because there was no use for them in the real world, in the students' real world. Now let me contrast that with some observational experiences I had with students who were completely engaged and who did learn and apply a lot of complex skills, and that was watching students playing video games in which there were opportunities within the game to create little computer programs that benefited the characters that were trying to succeed and proceed within the game. And what I observed was some pretty sophisticated computer programming skills that learners, some of who were identified as learners with special needs, that they were able to accomplish within those experiences. Because the game itself, or the experience itself, provided meaning for learning the programming skills and then actually accomplishing those skills. It had some worth to the learners, some gravity to it. And I would even argue that what the learners ended up with was a set of skills that is and remain rather important. They're worthwhile. And that was true 20 years ago, and I think it's just as true today. And this relates directly to the things I want you to accomplish in weeks 2 and 3 of this class. So I'm going to ask you to first of all consider that I believe there is a role that you play as a teacher that is the most important role. Now, I have a list of roles that teachers play, and it is not the list. It's not the basic list, but it is something that teachers do, or in some cases can, if they choose to, play. And let me just rattle through these real quick and talk a little bit about the one that I believe is above all others. So first of all, keeping the students safe is a role that teachers have to play. Helping the students learn how to be sort of active citizens in the culture in which they live. That's an important role, as evidenced by the fact that in many classrooms we have American flags and we have students who say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of the day, perhaps. I'm not sure that they understand at all grade levels what that means, and it's arguable that that is an act of patriotism without meaning, but it's a role that that teachers can and perhaps do play. Deciding what you think is important for students to learn is an important role that decisions that you make every day. Presenting rich bodies of knowledge or bodies of information and trying to present that in organized ways, that's an important role. Helping students learn how to define, improve, and maintain a healthy level of self-esteem. There are some teachers who really acknowledge that as an important role. Providing an environment for students to explore a variety of experiences, sometimes in ill-defined ways. That could be an important role to play. Helping students use computers and other technology-related tools to accomplish specific tasks. It could be the role of a technology teacher, but it could be the role of any teacher if that's a value of theirs. Arranging the student's environment to maximize the probability that they learn what you think is important for them to learn. By the way, arranging the environment is another way of describing the instructional design process or the lesson design process. Making sure students are prepared for their next level of education. That might be an important role that you play. Making sure students learn what other people think are important at the state or national or perhaps even international level. That's an important role. Some people think that just loving and nurturing the students is one of the most important roles. Helping students learn how to become critical thinkers might be a paramount role for some teachers. And finally, the last role, and I know there are others, but the last one I have is helping learners or helping students learn how to communicate effectively in a variety of environments, in written ways, in oral ways, and that kind of thing. So those are all some specific roles that you might play as a teacher, and you could argue that you have to play all of these roles. Now, I'm going to argue that the one role to me that is the most important role that you play as a teacher, Well, first of all, I'll say that when I ask teachers to think about these roles, a lot of teachers think, well, keeping students safe is the most important role. Because if they're not safe, then none of the other things can even happen. And that's very true. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of need, you know that apart from basic fundamental biological needs like oxygen and water and food, is the need to feel safe. And that is very, very true. But if you think about it, is that why you get up and go to school in the morning? It's because you want to keep them safe. Maybe some teachers feel that way depending on where they teach. But I think it's the administration's job fundamentally to keep students safe, to provide an environment physically that promotes safety, to have mechanisms in place that can deal with issues, behavior issues, and other things that could compromise student safety, and that you as a teacher would operate within that system that somebody else is supporting. So I would say that whereas safety is probably one of the most important concerns in education, I don't think it's why you wake up and go to do your job every day. There are other professionals whose that should be. I'm going to suggest that the most important thing you do as a teacher every single day is make good decisions about what you think is important for students to learn. That is key. And so everything, in my opinion, everything else that I mentioned are all subordinate to those decisions. For example, if you believe that part of your job is to help students become better communicators, then you are making a decision that you want them to learn how to be better communicators. If you want them to acquire critical thinking skills, then you're making a decision to facilitate critical thinking skills. And one thing that I unfortunately forgot to mention in my list of things, but it's important, and that is helping students learn how to get along with other human beings. Helping these children learn how to be part of a community successfully. If you value that as a teacher, then you'll teach your students how to be constructive members of a group, and you have to teach them how to do that. You can't just put kids in groups and expect that they're gonna learn how to do it well. That was a lesson I had to learn as a junior high school teacher on day one, and let me tell you, it took me years to learn how to do it well. And the first thing I had to admit is that I needed to learn how do you teach kids how to be constructive collaborators, you know. So I believe that the most important job you have every day as an educator is to make good decisions about what you want students to learn how to do. And granted, you will use as part of your decision-making process what society expects kids to learn at that grade level or in that subject area, and resources like the Virginia Standards of Learning are a really good organized way to inform you about some content-related things that are important for them to learn, but they are not. But it's your job to decide which of those are most important. In fact, it's even your job to decide that some of them are flat out not important, and you're not going to give them much sort of real estate in your experiences. Even though students might be assessed over them at some point in some high-stakes tests, you don't have to spend a lot of time, energy, and effort ensuring that they know how to perform things that you do not think are very important. And so, and by the way, the course notes includes some good information about how can you think and make decisions about what's important for students to learn. So that's the first thing I'm going to ask you to do in weeks 2 and 3, and that is to describe your students, describe the culture in their lives that influence and impact their ability to learn, and not just their ability, but also what might be important for them to learn. And then I'm going to have you make decisions about what you think are important for students to learn. And some of those decisions, you're going to look at the standards of learning that directly address your grade level or subject area, and you're going to decide what you think is important from those lists. Because in general, I personally don't believe that they're all important. I don't believe they're important enough to spend much time learning. And I feel that way about a lot of math skills, and I feel that way about a lot of social studies skills, and I feel that way about a lot of language arts. Don't get me wrong, some of the skills that are listed in those standards of learning, especially at the earlier grade levels, all seem really pretty worthwhile. But then comes the task of trying to decide, well, which are the most worthwhile, which are the most important. So you're going to do that, and then you're going to look at some other resources that can help you think about other types of skills that are equal, if not more important than content-related skills. And so skills related to communication, problem solving, artistic expression, and other things. I'm going to have you look at those and make some decisions about what you think is important for them to learn. And so I'm going to have you do that. Super important. And by the way, those lists, you're going to be working with those skills in pretty much all subsequent projects for this class. Because when I ask you to develop something related to instruction, I'm going to ask you to develop something that supports the learning of things that you've already identified are important. So you're going to do that, and then I'm going to ask you to learn more from the course notes about what instructional design is and what you do to arrange the learning environment in effective ways once you have identified what's important to be learned. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with some important terminology that I use as an instructional designer. So I'm going to have you review some notes and take a very short quiz online that you can use all the notes you want for, but I want you to be literate in some important areas of design. And then the very last thing I'm going to have you consider this during the next 2 weeks is related to the use of emerging technologies in the whole process of what's important to be learned and how might you get students to learn those things, or how might you use technology to support the design of good learning environments. And the emerging technology that I'm going to have you begin thinking more about is artificial intelligence, and how now and in the future you as a teacher might use AI resources to help improve your practice and also to help make your job a little easier. Because being a teacher is hard work. Being a good teacher is really hard work. And so those are the things that you're going to be addressing in weeks 2 to 3, and you're going to be asking to create a few things and post them within the course shell that you made, and that'll allow me to be able to access them and review what you did. So I look forward to learning more about you, your students, and what you think is important, and I hope you enjoy the next couple of weeks because they are really important.